Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. We have over 300 people, 350 people, I think, registered for this webinar, and it's great to see so much interest in the conversation we're about to have. My name is Amalka Nilmalgoda, and I'm a lawyer at EcoJustice on the nature and climate teams. And a lot of my work focuses on fighting to protect species at risk and Canada's biodiversity. So I'm really excited for the perspectives we're going to hear from the panelists today. We're aiming to bring you a hopeful conversation inspired by Sarah Cox's new book, Signs of Life, Field Notes from the Front Lines of Extinction. And if there's time after the panel, we may be able to take one or two audience questions. A few housekeeping notes to keep in mind. We recommend that you use headphones or earphones today to minimize background noise. Your mics have been muted to avoid accidental audio interference. The session today is being recorded so we can share it with folks who weren't able to attend the webinar. And finally, you can chat to the hosts and panelists throughout this 1-hour webinar. My colleague, Marley Whittle, will be monitoring the chat behind the scenes for questions, and she'll also be sharing links in the chat today. So I'd like to begin this conversation by grounding us on the land that we're on. Obviously, we have many people calling in from many different places. So I'll encourage you to reflect on whose land you're on today, but I'm calling in from the traditional and stolen territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations in so-called Vancouver. In my work, I think a fair amount about wild salmon. EcoJustice has a pretty long history of fighting to protect wild salmon populations. And for those that may not know, many wild salmon populations are experiencing significant decline and are considered either threatened or endangered. And this is a problem not only for the integrity of the ecosystem, but also for Indigenous communities. The salmon are incredibly important to the nations whose land I am on and are an integral part of their cultural, traditional, and spiritual practices. When I was thinking about this land acknowledgement and crafting this land acknowledgement, I came across this artist whose name is Siobhan Joseph, and she's a member of the Squamish Nation. And in 2021, she completed an art installation at the Squamish Public Library that depicts the Squamish story, Why the Salmon Come to Squamish Waters. And you might have seen this art installation if you've been to that library. But the story that this art installation depicts speaks of a time when humans and animals were the same. And it speaks about 4 brothers who went about doing good. Those brothers came to the Squamish people's village, and the Squamish chief asked them if they could bring salmon to their shores. The brothers agreed and went on a search for the salmon people. Heading on the long journey west, the brothers got the villagers to follow behind in their canoes until they reached the home of the salmon people. Once there, they offered herbs and medicine to the salmon chief, who became very friendly with the brothers and the Squamish villagers that had accompanied them. The salmon chief announced 4 days of feasts to welcome the guests, and in preparation, directed 4 of his young people to swim up the creek to a fish trap. As soon as the water reached those 4 young people's faces, they turned into salmon. When the time came for the feast, the salmon chief ordered the others of his people to go to the fish trap and bring back the 4 fish to prepare for the guests. The salmon chief told the guests to eat all that they wished, but to be careful and lay aside each bone, not throwing any away or destroying any of them. After each of the feasts, the bones would be thrown into the water, and the 4 young people would reappear and rejoin the others. Later, after the 4 days of feasts, the eldest brother explained to the salmon chief why they had come. He told the salmon chief that it was to request that he allow some of his salmon people to travel upstream to feed the Squamish people. The salmon chief agreed, but on one condition, that they promised to throw all the salmon bones back into the water, as they had watched his people do. The brothers and the Squamish villagers who had accompanied them agreed. And as they were leaving, the salmon chief told his guests that he would send spring salmon to them first in the season, then sockeye, then coho, then chum, and last of all, the humpback. And ever since then, the different salmon have reached Squamish waters every season in that order. And in reflecting on her art installation and her nation's story, Siobhan Joseph says, "I think it's one of my favorite legends. It's our custom that when you take something from the water, you bring it back and it will help bring back more salmon." And I think that understanding of how important it is to be in reciprocal and respectful relations with the land and learning from Indigenous nations who have stewarded this land since time immemorial is a perfect way to ground the conversation that we're about to have around imagining a better and safer future for us all. So before I begin introducing our panelists, we have many folks joining us today who may not know what eco-justice is or what we do. So we have a really beautiful video to share our mission and vision with you. And I think my colleague Jess is going to play that video now.
What can I do? When climate change threatens life as we know it, what can I do? When toxic air and water endangers entire communities, what can I do? When animals like the southern resident killer whales are going extinct in front of our eyes, what can I do? That's always been the question. It was 1989. The Exxon Valdez oil tanker ruptures in Alaska. It's one of the biggest environmental disasters of all time. Thousands of seabirds and marine animals killed. Livelihoods wiped out. Something had to be done. Legal minds from around the world came together. A young Canadian lawyer stepped up and helped take Exxon to court. That's when we started. Two people working out of the back of a car became Canada's largest environmental law charity, Eco-Justice. And now, we've gone from 2 to more than 200,000. Lawyers, scientists, experts, people like you. A growing collective using the law to tip the scales in favor of a safe, healthy, and more just future. We make polluters pay. When 1,600 ducks died in a lake of toxic waste, we helped secure a legal victory against the oil company responsible. We stand up for what's right. We went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada to defend the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act. We stop damage before it's done. Alongside Indigenous-led resistance, we blocked the Northern Gateway Pipelines project. But the climate crisis rages on. Big oil continues to fuel the destruction. So, what can we do? We go to court, holding the powerful to account. We rally alongside the public to demand better laws. What can we do? We build on more than 30 years of legal expertise to protect the people and places we love. Our wins are only possible because of you. What can we do? We keep pushing for a fairer world, one where there's justice for communities and justice for nature. Because we're Eco-Justice. But we need you. Together, you won't believe what we can do.
I may be a little biased, but every time I watch that video, I get chills. So we're going to start with the panel introductions, and it's my pleasure to first introduce Sarah Cox. Sarah is an award-winning author and journalist based in Victoria, British Columbia. Her previous book, Breaching the Peace, The Site C Dam, and A Valley's Stand Against Big Hydro, won a BC Book Prize and was a finalist for the Shaughnessy Cohen Prize for Political Writing. Sarah is an investigative reporter for the Narwhal, where she writes about environmental issues, and she loves kayaking, backpacking, hiking, and long-distance walking. And she has recently taken up bird watching. Sarah, can you tell us a bit about your book and what inspired you to write it?
Yes, and thanks so much for the introduction. As an environmental journalist, I found myself writing increasingly about the elaborate and increasingly expensive measures that we're taking to try to save endangered species at the very last minute. Things like hatching spotted owls in a lab while forest sounds play in the background, and flying pregnant caribou in helicopters to mountaintop pens so they can more safely give birth, or visiting Vancouver Island mountain where captive bred Vancouver Island marmots were being released after being implanted with transmitters. And that's after they were matched genetically through the equivalent of a racehorse stud book for marmots. And I found all of this fascinating, but also somewhat disturbing, and was really wondering why we can't take action to help species at risk before the 11th hour when they're already in the equivalent of the intensive care unit, but without much chance of long-term survival. What are we doing wrong? And more importantly, how can we turn this around? In Canada, we have about 5,000 wild species that are at some risk of extinction, including animals that are culturally and spiritually very important to Indigenous peoples, such as caribou and wood bison. And almost 900 of those species are critically imperiled, meaning that we stand to lose them relatively soon unless we turn things around. And one of the things that I dove into was the lack of legislation and enforcement of legislation in Canada to protect these species. The Federal Species at Risk Act applies automatically only to federal land, which in British Columbia, where I live, is only about 1% of the land base. And other provinces, including British Columbia, have no standalone legislation to protect endangered species. And those that do have legislation are either, in the case of Ontario, in the process of weakening it or not enforcing it. And so that means that environmental law charities like EcoJustice, time and time again, have to take governments, federal and provincial, where there are laws, to court to get them to follow their own laws. And something about this just doesn't seem right. So I took a year off work and set out on a trip, actually 2 trips, across 8 provinces to document how Canada is failing to protect wildlife and biodiversity. And I focused on the southern part of Canada, which is where the greatest biodiversity loss is and where the most at-risk species are. And I looked at why we're in this predicament in Canada in particularly. And in traveling through the provinces, I spoke to many, many people who are working to turn things around: eco-justice lawyers, scientists engaged in genetic rescue of endangered species, people from Indigenous communities who are working to protect wildlife and biodiversity through initiatives such as Indigenous protected and conserved areas, groups like World Wildlife Fund that are working on addressing threats to multiple species across the same ecosystem and costing out recovery actions, and also to people who have decided not to wait for governments either to enforce their own laws or to do something else, and people who have taken matters into their own hands to protect wildlife in their community or in their province. And it became a personal journey for me as well as a professional one, because I have to admit that I started out feeling somewhat despairing about the state of affairs after writing all of these stories about at-risk species. But the process of working on the book and meeting people from right across Canada who are doing so many things to protect wildlife really gave me great hope.
Yeah, that must have been such an inspiring process to connect with all those people. And I'm really excited to hear your thoughts later on today about what we can do and what actions we can take to make things better. So I'd like to welcome and introduce our second panelist, Chloe Fraser. Chloe Fraser is a climate storyteller, communications advisor, and facilitator committed to uplifting young environmentalists. She currently works in communications at the Pacific Salmon Foundation and facilitates climate workshops with City Hive in Vancouver, Canada. Chloe has written pithy content for various projects, including Climate Strike op-eds and family-friendly museum exhibit on mining justice. In 2023, she built and led an accredited climate communication seminar at the University of British Columbia. Named a top 25 under 25 environmental leader by Starfish Canada, Chloe continues to write and speak with authority, warmth, and joy about our climate futures. Chloe, I'm really excited to have you on the panel today. And first, I'd love to know what drives your interest in climate communications and storytelling?
Thank you, Imelka. I think something my bio doesn't capture is that I'm someone who loves enjoying sunny afternoons at the park. I'm someone who loves snow. I love seeing the seasons change. I grew up in Quebec watching maple leaves fall. And it took me a long time to see communications and stories as the powerful tool that they are to ensure that we keep having those experiences. As a teenager, I was really interested in traveling around the world, and I Googled for traveling schools and found one, and somehow got a scholarship to live in 8 different countries around the world for about 3 to 4 months at a time. And so I was sent as a very shy bookworm to Peru as a 15-year-old. And it was a really privileged experience. But what it also showed me was already how much we were losing because of climate change and how much it was impacting people on the ground who were trying very, very hard to hold on to basic rights and experiences like drinking clean water. I saw people hold water protests to get clean water in Peru. I saw the impacts of habitat destruction in Morocco. I went to India and saw how devastating the monsoon could be and how difficult it is to live with smog in a city like Mumbai and how much it affects your quality of life. And so this gave me a lot of really big emotions. But I came home to my very small town in Quebec to find that it was really difficult to share what I'd seen and what I'd witnessed with people I loved. And I didn't have the words to convey how important this suddenly felt to me. And so I started thinking of writing not only as an outlet, but as a way to build bridges with people I cared about and as a way to share those stories with them. And I started learning more and more about storytelling. Humans are storytellers. We're 22 times more likely to remember a story than a fact. So I love that you started your land acknowledgement today with a story. And I ended up studying a lot of big things at university, but working in marketing and communications on the side. And I'd go to these classrooms and learn about environmental policy and hear professors use really big words and sort of convoluted language. And then I'd go home after school and work in marketing and have my mentor tell me, hey, you know, that's not really interesting for people. Or maybe we should rephrase it so that it's more engaging, less depressing, more interesting. And I became really interested in seeing how we can connect marketing and communications to the environmental crisis and how we can start telling more powerful stories about the climate crisis that we're in. It's a wicked problem where we have so many of the solutions and we are not implementing them. And there are so many reasons behind that. But I think part of the issue is that people don't have the stories they need to make it happen. I think a lot about how polls show that in Canada, the vast majority of people are concerned or very concerned about the climate crisis and biodiversity loss. But when asked how many other people care, people will give statistics like 20%, 30% of people are concerned. And so we're very alone in living this climate crisis. And I think that climate communications and stories can help us build community and build the imagination for a future that we need to have if we want to secure that future.
Totally. I think those are such great points. And I think that I think a lot of people can maybe relate in one way or the other to that sort of communication breakdown that happens when you are trying to translate the magnitude of these crises. So I think it's really amazing that you found that power of storytelling to translate those complexities and build that communication with people. And last but not least, I'd like to welcome and introduce my colleague, Keegan Pepper-Smith. Keegan is EcoJustice's BC managing lawyer, and he will be celebrating his 8-year anniversary with EcoJustice at the end of this month. As a member of EcoJustice's nature and climate teams, Keegan's practice focuses on issues of forestry management, ecosystems and species protection, and major infrastructure development. He has represented EcoJustice and clients in regulatory proceedings and at all levels of court, including at the Supreme Court of Canada. Keegan received his Juris Doctor from the University of British Columbia in 2013 and was called to the bar in British Columbia in 2017. And since 2020, he has lived and worked on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nation. Keegan, you've spent most of your legal career at EcoJustice. What do you love most about working at EcoJustice as an environmental lawyer?
Thanks, Amalka. I've actually spent my entire legal career at EcoJustice, so even if this was the worst place to work, I wouldn't actually know any better. So, no, more seriously though, and I do hesitate to say this because it is quite cliche, but truly working at EcoJustice never actually feels like work for me. It's such a value-aligned organization, and I really cherish my work and the colleagues that I get to work with every day. Yeah, working in this as a lawyer, as a public interest environmental lawyer, can be incredibly stressful and at times depressing, being so immersed in the issues of biodiversity decline, climate crises, and having to do things like Sarah discussed, like constantly threaten and bring lawsuits just to force governments to enforce their own laws or follow their own laws. But, at the end of the day, having to show up at the office, my home office or the Vancouver office, and not have to check my values at the door is incredibly important to me. And I don't think there's many colleagues in our legal profession who could say the same. So it's really, the goal of the nature team, which I'm a lawyer on at EcoJustice, is to halt and to reverse the biodiversity decline within BC and to contribute to Canada's role in addressing the crisis globally. And to just be able to show up and contribute that in any small way every day is just, I'm really thankful for, and I'm thankful that I've get to do that through EcoJustice. And, relatedly, one of the things I love most about working at EcoJustice is our clients. We get to work with and on behalf of some of the truly most inspiring people and communities working on the front line of the biodiversity and climate crises. From Alexander Morton spending 30 plus years to trying to protect wild salmon from open net pens on the BC coast, to Chief Hobart of the Spuzum First Nation standing up against logging in the watersheds hosting the last known spotted owls. I'm just constantly in awe of the work of these people and these communities. And again, every day I'm thankful that we can do our little part and support their efforts through using our legal expertise.
Thanks, Keegan. I am a little bit earlier in my career than you are at EcoJustice, but I completely agree that the people we work for and with are such an inspiration and provide so much motivation to show up every day and do this work. So now it's time for the roundtable conversation. Our first roundtable question is the same for all of our panelists. And the question is, what are some of the drivers of the environmental challenges you encounter in your work? And I think we'll start with Sarah.
Thank you. So I want to talk a little bit about biodiversity loss, and through the story of the spotted owl, which Keegan mentioned, and which I think I caught a glimpse of the spotted owl in your video as well. And this is a species that is perhaps one of the most egregious cases of how we treat species at risk and wildlife in general in Canada. A case where we have known since the 1980s when scientists sounded the alarm that the spotted owl was endangered, until right now when we are in a situation where, when I started writing the book, there were 3 wild-born spotted owls left. And right now, there may be 1 left, but nobody has actually detected this owl. And even though there's been no official announcement, it's probably gone, which means that spotted owls in the wild are very likely extinct from Canada, or extirpated from the country. And in terms of the driver of biodiversity loss, so spotted owls, habitat destruction is the largest driver of biodiversity loss worldwide. And if you look at the spotted owl and what has happened to the spotted owl, this is a creature that has evolved with its surrounding physical environment, which are old growth forests. The owl nests in snags in the old growth trees. It requires a large tree to have its nest. It doesn't actually build the nest, although it'll sometimes take over the nest of another bird. And it relies primarily for food on 2 other creatures found in old growth forests, bushy-tailed wood rats and flying squirrels. And so you have an animal that is completely dependent on old growth forests. And yet what has happened in British Columbia, which is the only place the owl has ever been found, is that we have taken too much habitat for the spotted owl. We have cut down too many forests. And this has led us to the predicament we're in today, where the only spotted owls left in the province are 30 captive spotted owls in a breeding facility where hardworking biologists are doing their very best to try to breed them in the hopes that they may be released into the wild and that we can recover populations. And in a trip I did for the book, I had a very first-hand glimpse at this habitat destruction as a driver of biodiversity loss and as a driver of the spotted owl's extirpation from Canada. I went with Spuzim First Nation Chief James Hobart and also Joe Foy from Wilderness Committee to the valley where these last two of the 3 last spotted owls were at the time. And this is Canada's last breeding pair of spotted owls. We found out later that they had hatched 3 chicks over 2 years, which were captured by provincial government biologists and taken to the breeding center. When we visited, we didn't know that, and we were just looking at the valley where the owls were. To get to this valley off the Fraser Canyon, we went on a logging road, and the logging road bisected a wildlife habitat area that the provincial government had set aside for the owls where they were nesting. There was logging all around us, even though Spuzim First Nation had called for it to be stopped. And we drove right up to almost, well, very close to where the owls were known to be nesting. And the logging had only stopped because of an intervention by Spuzim First Nation. So this was just such an example for me of how we are driving biodiversity loss through habitat protection. We are not having a balance between resource extraction and habitat protection and biodiversity protection. And at the same time as this was happening, this scenario was unfolding in Spuzim Valley, the BC government was continuing to issue permits to clear cut habitat that federal scientists had identified as being essential for the spotted owl's recovery and long-term survival. And some of these permits were for forestry, some of them were for the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Biologist Jared Hobbs in one report documented how after the spotted owl was listed under Canada's Species at Risk Act in 2003, 60,000 hectares of the owl's critical habitat was clear cut. And so it really begs the question of what we are doing about biodiversity loss. And if habitat destruction is the primary primary driver of biodiversity loss. And there are other factors, and there are other reasons why the spotted owl is having a rough time as well, but habitat destruction is the primary one. What are we doing about this? And why is there not a change? Why is BC not focusing on this? Why are we not balancing resource extraction with habitat protection and biodiversity protection? And yeah, I think I'll leave it at there.
Yeah, yeah, I think Ecojustice also has a pretty long history of working to fight to protect the spotted owl, and I've had the ability the opportunity to work on that file a little bit and sort of learning the story and learning the history and seeing sort of time and time again this prioritization of logging over the protection of that species has been really, yeah, frustrating. Chloe, can you tell us some of your thoughts on this question?
I work in communications at the Pacific Salmon Foundation. And so a lot of what Sarah just shared with the owl, I do see with salmon. And I speak a lot with local community groups and Indigenous community members and stream keepers and people who are really invested to restore our salmon habitats and to do a lot of work on the ground in their area to help salmon thrive. And I do sense this sort of fatigue around feeling like they're working against like something so much bigger than them and a management system that makes it really hard to enable concrete change and have a visible impact. And I see that a lot in the climate work that I do. I work with a lot of youth-led groups and campaigns around Vancouver. And I think that one of the drivers of climate change I see the most is this lack of accountability. And I'll leave legal accountability to the experts here, but from a communications perspective, so much of this, I guess, confusion and despair has been fueled by a lot of narratives that we've imbibed over years and years. Trade and oil and gas trade groups have invested relentlessly in lobbying and advertising and public campaigning to spread a sort of doubt and distraction and also spread narratives that serve them. Often they focused on how huge and global and abstract climate change is. They've spread doubt around how it takes place and whether it really impacts people. And they've also cast the blame on individuals, and so often push individuals into thinking that making meaningful change when it comes to climate means taking sacrifices and taking it upon themselves on an individual level to make change. And that makes it really hard to work with the systems in place collectively to make policies change, to make change happen at a systemic level. The David Suzuki Foundation has a really good report on how a lot of younger people, millennials and Gen Z and youth, so often focus on their own social media accounts, their friend groups, making change happen around them in a visible manner, but aren't interested in civic engagement and won't actually go up to town hall and advocate for change there or call their MP or have discussions with people who do have authority and who do have power to make these big decisions. And that continues to feed into a vacuum of accountability where people with the authority to make change happen aren't confronted enough to the consequences of their decisions. And it also feeds into this sort of desperation on a local level to have meaningful impact. And I think something else I want to share that I've seen is what it does for people who do take a stand, is it makes them look more radical than they really are. It stigmatizes people who decide to really take meaningful action, and it makes them look more alone than they are. and that they need to be in order to work with these bigger systems and confront them meaningfully. And so I think about that a lot. I think that, yeah, that one of the main drivers is this lack of accountability. And on the flip side, the kind of methods that campaigners have used on an individual level and continue to use because they lack the community and the support to meaningfully confront those systems.
Totally. I think those are such great points. And I think that this individualization of what is a real systemic and structural issue that forces people to sort of be those individual flashpoints can lead to a lot of burnout as well. So I think, yeah, those are all real significant challenges. Keegan, what about you?
Yeah, so I think there are two main drivers in my work, and Sarah's example of the spot owl just like is such a perfect encapsulation of the issues that I'm going to discuss. And so it's definitely top of mind while I think about these examples. But you know, if I was to put my idealist, my like young law student walking through the halls of law school hat on, I think of laws as like as reflections of the values of the society at a point in time. And so unfortunately, if you look at our laws that govern natural resources within Canada or in BC, they're reflective of a value of colonization, exploitative and based on an exploitative worldview that values access and extraction over all else. And so spot owl is a perfect example. You know, until recently, just last year, BC's forestry management regime was constrained by this frankly ridiculous and obscene unduly reduce the supply of timber clause. So the intent of this clause was to ensure that actions taken that would constrain the supply of timber, as in setting aside a wildlife habitat area to protect the spot owl and its habitat, could only be taken so far as to not unduly reduce the supply of timber for the industry. And depending on who you talk to in government, that meant a 1 to 3% reduction in timber supply. So really, this clause in the regime ensured that any level of biodiversity protection or species protection could not get in the way of logging, even if the logging took place in threatened ecosystems and critically endangered, next to critically endangered species. So my first point is that you can't really expect much from laws and institutions when it's clear that the extraction, this extraction worldview is valued over all else, including preventing the suffering of species, ecosystems, and communities. Second, I would say that when we do have laws that on their face are designed to protect biodiversity or to halt the climate crisis, including for at-risk species, governments rarely use these tools to protect these species or these spaces, let alone proactively address underlying issues before it reaches a crisis state. So to give just one example, under the Federal Species at Risk Act, or SARA, the federal government can issue an emergency order to protect an at-risk species and its habitat if that species is facing imminent threat to its survival or recovery. So, for example, logging of the habitat of the last known spotted owls in the wild. Perfect example. Well, since this power has existed under the Species at Risk Act, since it was introduced in 2003, it has only been used twice by the federal government. So, in other words, notwithstanding this clear biodiversity and species crisis we're facing with thousands of species on this path to extinction, the federal government has only ever found the will to use this power to do something about it twice over the last 20 years. So, you know, for me, this shocking underutilization of this important power really brings home the fact that even when you have laws designed to protect species and biodiversity at that crisis stage, governments are still captured by this extractive capitalist mindset that prioritizes exploitation and extraction over all else, even if it means condemning these species to extinction.
Yeah, thanks, Keegan. It's frustrating to say the least that the colonial foundation of our legal system impacts not only the tools that we have available to demand action, but whether and how those tools are used, like you said. So panelists, help us paint a picture of a brighter environmental future. Sarah, for wild species and biodiversity, what would that look like?
Well, I think following up on what Keegan said, we start by enforcing the laws that we already have. For the book, I spoke to Sean Nixon from EcoJustice, and he's a lawyer who quite likely has brought more legal cases for endangered species than any other lawyer in Canada. And he has been covering these issues for several decades. And he compared the Federal Species at Risk Act to buying a lawnmower, sticking it in your garage in a box and leaving it there in the box. And then 20 years later, you look out and you say, oh, my lawn is a terrible mess. That lawnmower is absolutely useless. And that's basically like what has happened, as Keegan pointed out, with emergency orders only being used twice in the 21-year history of the Species at Risk Act. So we need to start by enforcing the act. And then in 1996, provinces, except for Quebec, made a promise to look at their own legislation and take a look at their own legislation and policies, and to take action to protect species at risk and their habitats. And that largely has not happened. We have four provinces and a territory that have not even passed standalone legislation, BC and Alberta among them. We have Ontario, which was kind of the gold standard for such legislation, not enforcing it. Nova Scotia also has very strong legislation on paper, but they're not enforcing it. And so the provinces need to fulfill that commitment they made many years ago. I think importantly, we also need to change our mindset that nature is something to be exploited. Again, as Keegan touched on, if we think about our dependency on nature, and even just one small, very, very small example is that 3/4 of global food crop types rely on insect, animal, or bird pollinators. So if those species become extinct or greatly diminished, it's going to impact us. So ultimately, as a species, we depend on nature and biodiversity for our own survival, and we ignore biodiversity and species at risk at our own peril, I think. Indigenous-led conservation is absolutely key to protecting biodiversity and species at risk. There are studies that show that biodiversity is greater on land managed by Indigenous peoples, even greater than in parks. That will probably come as no surprise to Indigenous peoples, but that is well documented in Western science as well. And while some individual species will probably always need individual attention, our approach to focus on just one species at a time with a very long and convoluted process of getting it listed, of having a recovery plan, of environmental law charities having to take the government to court to get them to follow the recovery plan, having to go back to court, having to constantly battle it out while the species circles closer and closer to the extinction or extirpation drain. That is not working. So we need to have more of an ecosystem-based approach as well. And also, we have no budgets attached to recovery efforts. So the public doesn't know and can't weigh in on how much it would cost to get a species out of the intensive care unit. And there's some work underway across the country to cost that out. And the amount of money to actually turn things around for a great number of endangered species is not that much. For example, for $15 million a year, or about $3 a year for every person in BC, we could give more than 100 species at risk in the Fraser River estuary a fighting chance of survival over the next 25 years. That's not a lot of money in terms of government expenditures. So I think we need to be transparent about the cost of these things. And it's hard not to think that if the public knew how relatively little this would cost in comparison to other expenditures, that they would not want to take action to improve the situation of species at risk and biodiversity.
Totally. Those are all such excellent points, Sarah. Thank you. Chloe, what would a safe climate future look like?
I think a safe climate future would be a place where there is a culture of real transparency and accountability, and where organizations and institutions are responsible for putting out narratives and stories that are concrete and real, and where oil and gas advertising and industry advertising that isn't transparent is illegal, where lobbying for these purposes is no longer acceptable, and where climate change is mentioned in the media routinely, every day, every other day. In a lot of the wildfire coverage and flood coverage that we've had in the last couple of years, it is actually atrociously rare to hear the words climate change. People can realize that something very big is happening and could have a local impact on them, but they don't have those narratives tied together and that kind of accountability built into the stories that they're receiving about these climate impacts. I think also a safe climate future would be a future in which there's a budget for people to do meaningful environmental work, where there's funding for people to take on all the work that needs doing when it comes to biodiversity loss, habitat restoration, conservation, and so much more. I've been getting involved more with Youth Climate Corps and Youth Climate Corps, and the idea is that young people should have a right to good green jobs where they're actively participating in securing a future for themselves that is happy and safe, and where they don't have to choose between affordable options and options that safeguard the environment, where it feels like their life can be lived in sync with their values and without having to sacrifice some of those values to prioritize the cost of living or the housing crisis, and to solve some of these other issues in their lives. And so I think this question is really important because we don't have a very good imagination for that future. We know a lot about how we want to get there, but when it comes to actually imagining it, there's a lot of blind spots and there's a lot of holes. And I think a lot of the realities we need to imagine are places where communities can come together, where people don't burn out as much, and where they place real value in the environment, where they don't shame each other for taking action in different ways or for living out environmental values in different ways, and where there's more focus on cooperative and sustainable living. And so I hope that 23-year-olds like me can imagine that and see that for themselves, because a lot of the statistics that were shown are in 2050, and I'll be 49 years old in 2050. It's not that far at all. It's going to be my midlife crisis. And I want it to be a livable and happy future.
Thanks, Chloe. That future that you outlined sounds truly amazing, and I really hope that we can all get better at dreaming as we work towards that future. Keegan, you gave us some reasons earlier about why our legal system fails to protect species at risk and the environmental health and well-being of plants, animals, and people in Canada. What transformations have to take place at the legal system level to achieve a brighter environmental future?
Yeah, I mean, this one's pretty easy for me because it really just relates to the two issues that I identified earlier. The idea that we have some laws on our books right now that are not being followed by our governments or not being enforced by our governments, that they could take immediate action under to address the crises, or at least try to address parts of the crises. And Sarah did a great job of covering that. So I'll just focus on my second point, which is you know, we need to recognize and really actually just dismantle this legal system that is based on these worldviews of exploitation over all else. You know, they need to be replaced with institutions and laws that value and prioritize Indigenous rights and biodiversity and ecosystem health, like full stop. I'm fundamentally believe that's the only way we get to a future that we need. And, you know, so we've seen a couple of positive steps, at least with respect to these two issues in BC. BC adopted the Declaration of the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples Act, passed unanimously through the legislature in 2019. The legislation, among other things, is designed to ensure that BC's laws are consistent with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. You know, I do believe that this could put us on a path to a real system change, to, you know, to ensuring that our laws here are actually consistent with and reflective of this seminal international agreement for the rights of Indigenous peoples in the province. Second, over the last several years, BC has been working to fulfill a commitment on adopting a biodiversity and ecosystem health framework. So this is supposed to represent a paradigm shift to prioritizing biodiversity and ecosystem health in all government decisions across all resource sectors. So, you know, given where we're at, I'm not holding my breath on this one, but if the government fulfilled this commitment, it could truly be a game changer, where we flip the assessment from, you know, going back to the example I gave earlier, does protecting biodiversity or does protecting spotted owls unduly impact the supply, the timber supply, to flipping that question to, does exploiting these resources unduly impact our ability to protect biodiversity and ecosystem health? And I think that would be a fundamental shift in our mindset about how we need to be tackling these issues and what we need to be prioritizing.
Totally. Thank you so much, Keegan. So I think we're starting to have a picture of a climate safe future with thriving biodiversity. It looks like holding those in power accountable to fulfilling their commitments. It looks like transparency from institutions and industry and open conversations on environmental issues. And it looks like a shift away on both an institutional and societal level from the extractive and exploitative way that we tend to view our environment to an approach that prioritizes Indigenous rights and ecosystems health. So for the folks who are joining us today, they're probably wondering, what can I do? So panelists, in 2 minutes or less, what will it take to reach this environmental future, and what can we do? Chloe, let's start with you.
Thank you, Amelka. I'm very inspired by a scientist called Katharine Hayhoe, who says the most important thing you can do for the climate crisis is talk about it. And she's very clear that it involves talking about it casually and without blame or shame or judgment, and having open conversations about how it's affecting you, what you're noticing in your area, and what you've been trying to do or how you've been trying to get involved with your family, your friends, and your acquaintances. And I do think that's really important. I think that a lot of people feel cast out from environmental movements, or perhaps paralyzed and unsure on how to begin. And having those conversations invites them in and makes them feel welcome in something that affects them too. I also think people need to get involved with civic processes. Working with City Hive in Vancouver has convinced me that youth especially, but so many people who are rightfully disillusioned with government and with institutions are, instead of fighting back and getting involved more ferociously, stepping away. And that's a huge mistake. We need to be showing up to vote. If you don't know when the next elections are happening, I invite you to look it up, to add it to your calendar, be ready to vote, be informed. And we need to be showing up to talk to our politicians. We need to be calling them and emailing them and going to town hall meetings and showing up for government consultations. And I think finally, something I want to share on a more personal level is to make climate advocacy something fun and something interesting and something that allows you to socialize with people you care about. Make it something so lovely that It is a natural part of your life, and it doesn't burn you out or feel like a chore. And that will help you get involved for the long run.
Thanks, Chloe. Keegan?
That was such great advice. I really love that last piece of advice you provided, Chloe. Thanks for that. Yeah, for me, I tried to weave in this idea that at its highest ideal, law is, a reflection of what society values at a point in time. And I truly do believe that law can be a really powerful tool of change and really truly reflect what we value as society. Unfortunately, I don't think we're there. We're not even close to there yet. And so we need to keep working on holding government to account. We need to keep working on holding corporations to account. We need to keep working to force government to enforce its laws and to change laws that actually better reflect our values as society in the time that we're in, the crises we face. And so unfortunately, that work is not cheap. It takes a lot of funding and resources. And I just, for me, I'm just so thankful for the folks out there who are a lot of who are which on this webinar, who are supporting eco-justice, who are supporting our clients, who are supporting our partners, who are supporting Indigenous communities and local small communities on the front lines of these crises. I'd say just keep showing up, support these communities, support these organizations that are doing the work, and hopefully we'll keep being able to fight this fight for a more just, equitable, and sustainable future for all of us.
Yeah, I truly hope so. Thanks, Keegan. Sarah, you met people across the country who are using community-based solutions to protect local ecosystems and endangered species. Drawing on your experience, what does it take to create change, and what can people do?
I think in addition to what Chloe and Keegan have talked about already, what really was driven home for me was the importance of working on what one young man I interviewed called our little piece. So working at the local level, like so often we're focused, and I am in my work, on the big policy level, which is also important, but there's also so much that can be done on to safeguard biodiversity and wildlife at a very local level. Making sure that government policies, including new housing legislation, don't come at the expense of biodiversity, finding ways to build housing that also protect wetlands and species and preserve trees and endangered ecosystems and green spaces, and connecting those green spaces on a local level as well as on a much bigger level. And also when we think about protecting biodiversity, we're very often also addressing the climate crisis, because some of our most endangered ecosystems like old growth forests and grasslands and wetlands store a lot of carbon that is released into the atmosphere when they are destroyed. I noticed that somebody just popped up, put a message in the webinar chat saying that it's hard to envision making climate action fun because they're so anxious. And that immediately made me think about this group that I talked to in Nova Scotia that has basically taken matters into their own hands to try to protect at-risk species and forests, what's left of Nova Scotia's forests. And they have found, I don't know whether for some people it would be a fun way to do it, but they're bringing humor and really some very interesting ideas and tactics into their work. And basically they've gone out and camped in forests that are at risk, including in habitat for the endangered moose, the endangered mainland moose in Nova Scotia. And one of the things that they did when they were camping in the winter is to, first of all, they were looking for at-risk songbirds. And because Nova Scotia does have an endangered species law, they managed to protect an area that way. And then they were camping in the winter and they decided to go out and see if they could find some endangered lichens. They did find an endangered lichen, and then they told the government about this in an area that was slated to be clear cut. The government brought in their own biologist or their own lichenologist, who found more endangered lichens. And because Nova Scotia requires a buffer zone around the lichens, they spent a lot of time looking for these lichens and documenting them. And then by the time they had documented them all and the buffer zones were all put around the forest, it was uneconomical to log it. So they're bringing a very kind of creative and grassroots and on the ground solution to addressing biodiversity loss and also climate change. And I see in the chat that somebody else has asked about farmers and if there are any programs, or wondering if programs can be instituted to help farmers protect at-risk species and biodiversity. And that's one of the things I get into in the book. A wonderful trip I had was to southern Saskatchewan, where I met with ranchers who are working really hard to protect at-risk songbirds and other species on their land. And some of the methods they're using to do this are very simple, like grazing cattle on native prairie grass later in the season after songbirds have fledged. There's also an organization called the Saskatchewan Stock Growers Foundation that is signing agreements with ranchers and farmers so that they agree not to develop or plow their land, which is home to an endangered ecosystem and at-risk species, and writing up habitat management agreements with the ranchers and raising some money to compensate them financially for that. So I would say that there are lots and lots of initiatives underway at the local level, and that is a really great place to start.
Amazing. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you to our panelists for those really inspirational thoughts. I often reflect on this phrase that I heard a little while ago when I do this work, is that everything we do to make it better makes it better. And it's really inspiring to sit on this panel and hear you three talk about your experiences in making it better. And I could keep talking to the three of you for hours, but unfortunately we are actually over time. So we're going to wrap it up. I'd like to thank all of our guests who tuned in today. We so appreciate you sharing this time and virtual space with us. For supporters of ecojustice, you folks are awesome. Thank you for helping to make our work possible. And to our panelists, thank you for sharing your stories and inspiration with all of us. It's truly an honor to be fighting for a brighter environmental future alongside everyone here today. If you want to directly support Sarah, Chloe, and Keegan's work, there are a few things you can do, and Marley will put the links in the chat. You can help spread the word about ecojustice by sharing our animated video. Chloe encourages you to explore Open Door Climate, which is a volunteer-run social movement of climate professionals and climate career seekers. And if you have skills and experience to share, consider setting aside time to coach young environmentalists in your area. And finally, please buy Sarah's book or check it out from your local library, Signs of Life, Field Notes from the Front Lines of Extinction. You won't be disappointed. Thank you again to our panelists and our guests, and special shout out to our behind the scenes team, Marley, Jess, and Christy, for making this webinar run so smoothly. Thank you so much, folks, and enjoy the rest of your evening.